Mikey Pasek, who's joining us from UI Chicago. Michael was a PhD student through our program in social psychology here at Penn State several years ago. So it's fun to welcome him back. We're honored to have you back.
Thanks, Darren, and thanks for the opportunity. Today, what I want to do is share some new data, which is always risky. So poke holes and help me prepare this for publication on a cross-national investigation into religious nationalism and its correlates. And I just want to start by saying much of the work I'm going to present is not mine, meaning that I have a doctoral student, Arnab Zahor. She's prepared a lot of the slides that I'm borrowing from that she gave at a recent conference talk. Much of the data analysis here was done by Nava Kalori, a postdoc in my lab, and much of the data was collected by my colleague Samantha Moore-Berg, who you're going to hear from later. So it's a team effort, and it's my pleasure to try to tell some of this story. It probably comes as no surprise to many of you that we're living in a time with immense levels of rising religious nationalism. We can think back to January 6th when we saw Christian nationalists storm the Capitol. We can look at the Jewish nation-state bill and rising and very high levels of religious nationalism in Israel, there being Jewish nationalism instead of Christian. We can look to India, where we see the Waqf bill and other Hindu nationalist movements pushed forward by Modi. And all of this points to a pretty global phenomena, which is that we see religious nationalism on the upswing and politically relevant in contexts all across the world. This meshes with a fair amount of public opinion data. So some research from Pew Research Center asked the percentage of people who say that being a member of a particular religion is a critical part of being a part of someone's national identity. And here I'm just showing the people who agree. And there's a fair amount of variation across contexts. But what you can see is that there's a number of countries, such as the Philippines, where almost 90% of people say, yeah, that religion's really important. That's Christian, but you see it not just in Christian majority countries. You see Buddhist nationalism in countries like Thailand and Sri Lanka. We see Hindu nationalism, as I mentioned, in India, Jewish nationalism in Israel, and Muslim nationalism in many other countries around the world. So this is a global phenomena, and it occurs across religious denominations. And there's been a lot of work, particularly in sociology, political science, less in psychology, which I think is a real gap, and it's something that I'm trying to work on in my research, investigating religious nationalism. So work, for example, from Sam Perry, who's a colleague and sociologist at the University of Oklahoma, looks at contingencies and how religious nationalism relates to racial nationalism. It might even be a stand-in for white, which we show in a recent paper in Psych Science. Some work that I've done with a colleague, Mara Alkire, we show that religious nationalism, Christian nationalism, is highly laced with intergroup threat perceptions. So this feeling that others are kind of out to get us seems to be promoting it. And in fact, changing religious demographics and secularization appear tightly yoked to religious nationalism. And others show that, woked was a funny one. And others show that religious nationalism and Christian nationalism is detrimental to democracy, looking at support for violence, support for anti-democratic attitudes. What you might notice here, though, is this work is done with Christians. And you might notice even further that this work tends to be done in the US context. And that's where we're seeing a real proliferation of research within political science and sociology and now beginning in social psychology. Zeroing in, though, when we look at what that research has shown among US Christian nationalism, it tends to show that it is a phenomena that's on the right. So it's Republicans and conservatives who tend to be higher, not exclusively. There are liberals who still believe that the US should be a Christian country, but it is highly correlated with conservatism in this context. And what I want to ask today is to try to zoom out a little bit. What can we learn from the US and what can we apply and also learn from other contexts? So first I want to ask, is the link between conservatism and religious nationalism a global phenomena or solely a US phenomena? I then want to ask about that association that I found in my own work between threat and religious nationalism and ask whether it might be stronger among those in various geopolitical contexts on the political right than the political left. And then I want to ask, well, what about that relation between religious nationalism and some of these potential consequences? Obviously, all correlational research here, looking at support for anti-democratic attitudes and support for political violence across various democracies. And so to do that, I'm using data that Samantha helped lead collection. We had quota-representative surveys that we collected through organizations like YouGov and others in different contexts from 9 different countries. This included the US, Australia, Brazil, Germany, India, Israel, South Korea, South Africa, and the UK. So these countries vary in a lot of different ways. One way they vary is what's the largest religious group. A lot of these countries are Christian majority, or at least Christianity is the largest group, not always a majority of the population. That's an important distinction. We also, though, wanted to make sure we had some other religions. So we had a Hindu country being India and a Jewish country, Israel. One limitation, I'll note, we don't have a Muslim majority country in the sample. And I do also want to highlight, these are all ostensible democracies. So these are countries that we're not looking at authoritarian states, or well, maybe we are now. When we measured this, it wasn't necessarily authoritarian. So let's dive into that first question, the relation between conservatism and religious nationalism. So here what we have is we adapted some measures from Sam Perry and colleagues, and we asked questions like, the United States should be a Christian country, adapted for different contexts based on what the dominant religion in each country is. And we also measured people's political ideology. And what we wanted to look at here is, well, what's the association? So what I'm going to present is the results of a multi-level model synthesizing effects across all of the contexts to start. And on the x-axis is ideology, higher scores being more conservatism, the y-axis being religious nationalism. And we see a trend across all of the contexts. So people who are more conservative are higher in religious nationalism. We can also look at that at a country-by-country level. So here, just looking at the specific correlations in each country, the vertical dash bar represents no correlation, 95% confidence intervals, and point estimates. And what we can see is that in all of the 9 countries that we measured, people who are higher in conservatism reported higher levels of religious nationalism, particularly strongly in the US and Israel. Weaker in South Africa. Note there that the dividing line in South Africa is largely racial, and the political party structure is quite different. So that might be why it's a little weaker there. Okay, so we find then that conservatism and nationalism seem to be associated with each other across contexts. Well, what about threat? Just to dive in a little bit more, why might we expect threat and religious nationalism to be stronger correlations among those on the right? Well, for one, we see that religious nationalism is happening more on the right. But we also have other work from my collaboration, for example, that shows that religious nationalism might even be a contingent reaction to perceived threat from secularization in the left. And work from colleague Clara Wilkins also shows that perceiving threat from non-religious people tend to be on the left in most contexts, also seems to be highly threatening among those on the right and linked to these kind of pro-Christian ideologies. But noting that research is done in the US context. So we want to understand what's happening across other contexts. Here, I'm going to switch how we talk about things a little bit. Instead of talking about ideology, I'm going to look at political party membership. So what is the party in either a two-party or multi-party system that you would tend to vote for? What we did is we classified these parties based on whether they fall on the relative right or relative left of the political coalition in each context. We also validated that those made sense by looking at whether our party classifications actually differed in self-reported ideology. The reason that we do that, though, is because the measure of threat we have is a political measure. It's perceived threat from other political parties, so it's operationalizing threat in a social identity lens. So we're asking, for example, in the US, do Democrats worry that Republicans are making the country more dangerous? Various other political threat questions there as well. And we use contextually relevant parties. If somebody didn't identify with a main party, we'd ask them, well, of the 2 dominant ones that are the largest on the left and largest on the right, which one would you lean more towards? And we use that. So there's a little bit of messiness there, but hopefully our results show that we're even robust to some of that noise. So what do we find here? On the y-axis, religious nationalism, x-axis, perceptions of threat from the opposing party. We'll plot using the US color system of the right in red and left in blue. And we see that across contexts, those on the left who perceive higher threat had actually a little bit of a decrease in religious nationalism, but we found a strong positive relation among those on the right. So people who are more conservative or identified with more conservative parties who perceived more threat were the ones who were reporting the highest levels of religious nationalism in those contexts. We can also, again, break this down by context. Like, does it look consistent across each of the contexts that we studied? So here what we're looking at is the individual studies, and we found in 8 of the 9 contexts a significant positive correlation between perceived threat from the left and higher levels of religious nationalism among those on the right. We didn't find that in South Korea. This is a secular country. I said that some countries didn't have a majority religious group. That's one of those countries. There's something interesting potentially happening there. On the left, though, we found much more heterogeneity. So in some countries, we found a negative relation. For example, in the UK and US, those who perceive more threat from the right are lower in religious nationalism. In some countries, we found no relation, for example, India, and in some countries, actually just Germany, we found a positive relation. And this likely reflects how the different political breakdown works across different contexts. It's not equivalent to say left and right in every context. These really are quite different contexts, and they have different yokages to religion in each context. Okay, so the last question I want to ask is, does this matter? And obviously this is correlational data, so I can't speak to causation, but I do want to ask, do we see the relations across contexts between religious nationalism and kind of deleterious consequences for democracy across contexts that we also see in the US? So I want to focus on two. One is support for political violence using a measure from Calmo and Mason. How much do you feel it's justified for members of your party to use violence to advance your political goals? Another one adapted from Vocal and colleagues. For example, do you think that your own party should reduce the number of polling stations in areas that support the opposing party as a measure of support for undemocratic practices? So again, synthesizing in multi-level models, first looking in the left panel, support for political violence, we found a significant relation. And one thing to note, these measures are often critiqued, right? We know that support for political violence is sometimes overstated, although we obviously do see political violence increasing in this country. So you'll see, a fair amount of clumpage. For those in the back, it's probably a little hard to see. The raw data is plotted on the back, just the alpha's a little more transparent than I wish. We still had a range, and we really did have people all the way at the top, which likely reflects that in some contexts, support for violence is also more normalized than it might be in the States. And when we look at support for undemocratic practices, the means were a little bit higher, and we see that same positive trend. So people higher in religious nationalism were more supportive of both political violence and support for undemocratic practices. Notably, this holds even when you control for people's own ideology or party membership. So it really is this religious nationalism. It's not just replicating other partisan divides. When we look at that correlation again by country, what we see is that in most countries, we found that positive correlation between religious nationalism and support for partisan violence. The two exceptions here being Israel and South Africa. Just to note again, we're looking at partisan violence towards an out party in Israel. That out party is also Jewish. So that might be why we're not seeing a relation between religious nationalism and support for violence towards another party that also shares your religion. That is often different in other contexts. And South Africa, again, is a little bit more of a racial divide. And I think that might be part of what we're seeing. And support for undemocratic practices, we see positive correlations again across every context. So just to summarize, we found that religious nationalism was higher among those more on the political right than political left across contexts that we studied, particularly true among those who perceive more threat from the left if they're on the right. And religious nationalism was correlated with potential consequences that are pretty negative and detrimental to democratic health and functioning. Why does this matter, though? One of the gaps that I think we have when we talk about polarization and political conflict is it is a global phenomenon. It's not just here. Those of us who might be saying, should we be fleeing this country, might be saying, oh, we can't go to the Netherlands now because they have far-right extremism. Oh, we can't go here or there. This is happening everywhere. And one of the things that I think might be at the heart of it is that religious nationalism is also happening in many contexts. And so it's not enough to study polarization here only and religious nationalism here only, because we might be missing some of the global phenomena that actually mean not just focusing on specific contexts, but across contexts can reveal something about our human psychology and present some ideas for how we actually have to overcome the types of conflicts, because we can't just do it regionally. And that also means that we have to look at other forms of religion. So when we look at the social psychology of religion, for example, we just don't know much about other religions. We tend to study Christianity. In fact, most of our scales are Christian scales. So that's a gap. And we're hoping that we're starting to bridge that gap by expanding this work. Obviously, this raises a lot more questions than it might answers. I have no idea about the causal relation. Manipulating religious nationalism is quite hard. We're trying. We have some initial ideas for how to do it. So this is correlational, and I want to own that. I also don't totally know why we see so much heterogeneity on the left. And I would love to hear from some political scientists here about understanding how to think about these contexts and the different structures, because I think that might play a role, but I'm really open to people's ideas. And I just want to end because, I haven't explicitly linked this to morality. And, you might be saying, well, what's the moral part? Well, I do think religion is intricately tied with morality. They're not the same, and we do differentiate them, and we can differentiate them, and I think that's important. But what we see is that Christian nationalism itself is very much a moral drive to put your values onto others. It's this idea that my way of life is morally superior to your way of life, my religion is morally superior to your religion. And that might be part of why it tends to be so consequential. And that's some work, for example, that now shows that Christian nationalism is one of the reasons that we might see a ban on mRNA vaccines and other forms of basic science. In fact, the director of the OMB right now is a devout Christian nationalist, and that may be why we're seeing NSF and NIH facing extreme cuts, because this is a moral battle for the way of life in this country. And some work by Penn State researchers even looks, for example, to see that Christian nationalism is highly associated with the idea that we should have a lot of in-group loyalty. So different kind of ways of thinking morality are deeply intertwined. With that, again, I just want to thank Zarnab and Nava for really helping to bring a lot of this work to light, and Samantha for your role in collecting all this data. Thanks.
Thank you. I think this was a really interesting talk. Thank you for incorporating data from different cultures as well. I'm from Turkey originally, and I'm just gonna say one thing. The finding between the thing that you found between religious nationalism and let's say attachment to democracy, it kind of reminds me of a quote from Turkey's current president Erdogan. Once he said, democracy is basically like a tram for them, a train, and when they reach the destination, they don't really need that anymore. He basically said that, and I think the context was basically, if you have religious values, about how the world should be governed, democracy is basically like an instrument for you. It's not a goal. But if you're a secular person who's participating in politics, probably you don't really have a really holy goal that you have to reach in the society. So democracy is maybe something more like a goal for you instead of a instrument. So I just wanted to speculate about that.
So maybe one more question, unless you wanted to respond to that, Mikey. Or... let me just make sure we don't have anything online. Yeah, the last question from one of our later speakers, from Joseph Phillips, also from our Penn State student. How do you think these findings generalize to minority religions?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. One of the surprising findings from Sam Perry and Andrew Whitehead and others' work is that you still find a number of people who belong to minority religions who endorse Christian nationalism in this country. And I find that kind of perplexing. So it's this idea that you might think, oh, well, yeah, I might be a Muslim or a Jew, but we still are a Christian country, and Christianity upholds a lot of values. My expectation is that to the extent that they find that, we should still find that that's stronger among people who are on the right. I don't know fully. I think I can look at our data. This wasn't collected for the purpose of studying religion, so we're kind of light on some religion-specific variables. But my guess is that we'd still see pretty consistent findings in terms of relations, but that mean levels of religious nationalism would be very, very different.
All right, thanks, Mikey. And again, if there are any other questions, please follow up with us afterwards.